Hello dear viewer, my dear student, welcome to your favorite program, The Knowledge Quest. Our favorite program that we bring you the knowledge and we discover what is written in books. Time for History and Government. I am your teacher, Alex Obara, and today we shall proceed discussing on what we began in our last discussions, that is the contacts between East African and the outside world. So far we've been able to explore and see, and we have seen the early visitors who came to the East African coast before 1500 AD. We went further and discussed and saw those who came between the 17th and the 18th century. And we saw among them the early Arabs come to the East African coast and the development of the Indian Ocean trade. We went further and discussed on the coming of the Portuguese, and we saw how they conquered East African coast and ruled for a period of 200 years, and thereafter their decline in the year 1698. And there we saw again the coming of the Omani Arabs, also who ruled the East African coast under the reign of one Sayyid Said. We discussed and saw some of the conflicts that the families which were ruling the East African coast faced, to specifically the Al-Busaidi family and the Mazrui family, and we discussed in detail. And we said that the East African coast during this rule were mainly ruled by Arab families, and we say those families included the Al-Busaidi, the Nabahani family, and the Mazrui family. And further still, we discussed about the entrenchment of the rule of Sayyid Said after defeating the Mazrui family. And thereafter, we also discussed on how Sayyid Said established plantation farming on the East African coast. And today, we are proceeding and we're going to see how there was development of long-distance trade, and thereafter we shall go into international trade. And therefore, I'll just take you through a quick recap on what we began discussing on a long-distance trade. We asked ourselves this question, that where did this long-distance trade take place? And we said it took place between the East African coast, that is the areas bordering the ocean or the sea, and the interior in the 19th century. And we said that this trade involved the exchange of trade items between communities over long distances. So the reason why it is referred to as long distance trade, it is because it involved exchange of trade items between communities over long distances. And we went further and looked at the reasons that led to the development of long distance trade. And we mentioned them. Just a reminder very quickly, we say number one was the demand for ivory in Europe and America. That means that due to demand, people had to come to East Africa to look where those actually ivory were available. And then we say there was number two, a demand for slaves due to plantation agriculture, which we say that was introduced to East African coast by one Sayyid Said. And this plantation farming, of course, apart from East Africa, it was taking place in other parts of the world. And we gave examples and about the French sugar plantation in Mauritius. And we say those were examples, and also in the Reunion Islands. And then we discussed further and said some of the methods which were used during the long distance trade involved barter system, which was the first system of trade which involved exchange of goods for goods. Then further, after the collapse of the barter system of trade, we had the form of currency, whereby initially or at the beginning they used cowrie shells as a form of currency, and later there was introduction of coins to the East African coast, or rather to this trade, which was introduced by Sayyid Said himself. And then further we discussed on the kind of goods which were imported to East African coast and those which were exported out of East African coast or outside the interior of Africa. And we said examples of goods which were imported to the interior. All right, imports to the interior, that means these are the goods which were not locally available, and therefore it means they were imported or brought into the interior. We said examples were beads, utensils, okay? We talked about iron holes, cowrie shells, cotton cloths, copper wire, red dyes, and brass wire. So these are examples of goods which were imported to the interior. And then there are those goods which were taken out of the interior and exported. They included slaves, ivory, animal skins, iron ornaments, gum, rhinoceros horns, copal, beeswax, and honey. So these are just examples of goods which were exported from the interior of East African coast. We looked at the principal trade routes, and we said there were three specific, or there were three trade routes which were actually used during this trade. The first one, we said it began from Mombasa, okay? It went through the Mijikenda area on to Taita Taveta, where from there it branched into two. One route went to Kilimanjaro to Lake Victoria region. Then the other proceeded to northward from Taita Taveta across Galana River into Cumberland, all right? Then to the Mount Kenya region and the western parts of Kenya. So this is the second, this is how the first trade route diverted. Then we had the second one, which began from Kilwa. These are old towns along the East African coast. So Kilwa to Yao, where it branched to southwards to Ksewa in Zimbabwe. And then we had the third one, which began from Bagamoyo, okay? It began from Bagamoyo to Tabora, where it branched northward to Buganda, with the western branch proceeding to Ujiji and then to Zaire. So these were the three principal or main trade routes which were involved in the long distance trade. Then we looked at the organization. This one I will not be able to take you through today. We discussed in detail about it, and we saw how the trade was organized, who were involved, what kind of methods of trade were used, how did they travel. All those we discussed in our last discussion. So today, I want us to look at the consequences of the long distance trade. Consequences is synonymous to the results or the outcome of the long distance trade. So the first consequence of long distance trade is growth of towns. That means that those areas which were the main shopping centers, those areas which were the main meeting points, later developed to become towns. So the examples of towns which developed as a result of long distance trade include Mombasa, Lamu, Pemba, Zanzibar, and Kilwa. So these are just examples. Of course, there are many towns that developed as a result of long distance trade. The number two, another consequence is that there was increased volume of local and regional trade. Local, this one involved exchange of goods and services of people between or within the same geographical region. All right, so increased volume of local, and regional included a larger geographical region in East Africa and the interior. So that means that this trade increased the volume of exchange of goods and services. That was how it was done locally and both outside the context of their villages and communities, which we refer to as regional trade. Then number three, we said there was introduction of new crops to East Africa. That means that as this trade was taking place, there were those crops which initially were not available in East Africa. They were introduced, or rather we say they were brought into East Africa. Examples we said include rice, all right, bananas, sugarcane, and mangoes. These are examples of crops which were actually introduced, which hitherto were not available in East Africa. So talking about rice, which is a delicacy among Kenyans, bananas, a delicacy, sugarcane, and mangoes, those are crops which came as a result of long distance trade between East Africa region. And then further, we looked at consequence number four, that there was emergence of a class of wealthy merchants. That is to mean that there was a class of wealthy people who were merchants, or rather traders, who emerged as a result of the long distance trade. That means they were able to make a lot of profit, and thereby they were able to, prosper in as far as wealth is concerned. So examples of those wealth merchants, or a class of wealthy merchants that emerged, include the following. We had Chief Kivoi, all right, of Ukambani. This was a chief among the Kamba people who was largely involved in long distance trade. Then we have Ngonyo of the Mijikenda, all right? So Ngonyo is also another merchant who emerged as a result of this trade. Then we have Msiri of Nyamwezi and Nyungu ya Mawe, right? So also we have Tipu Tip. So these are examples of people who emerged as a result of the long distance trade, okay? So there was that aspect of emergence of a wealthy class of wealth merchants. Then number 5, as a result of this long distance trade, there was the aspect of spread of Islam into the interior by Arab traders. Remember we said Islam as a religion began on the coastal part of Kenya, all right? But as a result of this trade, the Arab traders moved into the interior, all right? And thereby they were able to move along with their religion, which is Islam. And therefore that led to the spread of Islam as a religion to the interior of East Africa. That's why you realize that some part of the interior of Kenya, Uganda, and Tanzania, we have Islam as a religion. The number 6, Kiswahili, a hybrid of Arabic and Bantu languages, penetrated into the interior. Remember also we discussed this last time and we said Kiswahili emerged as a language of communication largely along the coastal regions as a result of early interactions between the Arabs and the Bantus. But now because of the result of this trade, you realize now that Kiswahili as a language is spreading further. That means it is going into the interiors. Apart from it being used on the coastal region, it is also going to be used on the interiors of East African coast. And that is why, ladies and gentlemen, Kiswahili is a widespread language, not only in the coastal region, but including to the interior regions where you and I could be coming from. Then also number 7, there was the aspect of development of money economy that replaced barter trade. So today you realize that we have money economy in the world, money market and all that. That began early long time ago during the long distance trade, and we shall discuss in a little while and see who introduced this aspect of using money. Remember we said the early method of trade which was used or system was the barter trade system. It had its own challenges and disadvantages, but with the time this problem was solved with the introduction of currency, which we said was cowrie shells, and later the introduction of coins, as we shall discuss in a little while. Then number 8, there was the opening up of the interior through trade links. That means that there were some areas which were not accessible. They were not easily accessible. But because of this trade, those areas were now accessible. That means they were opened up. Because of what? Because of the trade links. That means the trade routes which were passing through those interior areas. Therefore, they could also be accessed easily. All right? So means those areas were accessible and they were opened up for more exploration and for more business activities and trading activities in those given areas. Number 9, there was the aspect of emergence of strong kingdoms. All right? So these strong kingdoms developed as a result of, number 1, the profit and tax, which was imposed or which was put on the trading system, or rather the traders who used to pass through the various kingdoms. They had to pay tax or tribute to the king, and as a result, several kingdoms developed which were strong. Examples, we had the Wanga kingdom among the Luya in western Kenya. We have the Yao and the Nyamwezi. These kingdoms also developed as a result of the long distance trade. So the kings who were actually ruling those given kingdoms were able to get tribute, and of course they were given some presents and gifts which they were able to use in building stronger kingdoms. Number 10, we say that the Sultan of Zanzibar extended his influence into the interior. All right? He extended his influence in the interior because he was able to govern. That means he was able to influence how things were done in the interior of East African coast. All right? So that's also another influence. So that means to some way he was able to extend, right, the coverage of his kingdom, not only in Zanzibar, but also into the interior of East African coast. Then number 11, we saw it led to the development of plantation agriculture. That is as a result of the demand of the goods which were required for the trade. So therefore, for these goods to be available for trade to take place, there had to be agriculture, right, which will produce or provide the goods and services, the goods required for the development of this trade. So in some way, indirectly, this trade led to the development of plantation agriculture. Okay. Then number 12, which is our next point, it enhanced good relations between communities and promoted cultural interaction. So I was not able to complete the statement. It enhanced good relations between communities and promoted cultural interactions. That is to mean that communities, several communities were able to interact. They were able to borrow actually good culture. They were able to borrow some aspects from each community. Apart from that, we had issues of intermarriage, issues of cooperation between different communities as a result of the long distance trade. So ladies and gentlemen, as you can see, long distance trade had positive impact on the people of East Africa in as far as how it influenced their activities. Now, having looked at that, I want us to look at the negative influences of long distance trade, the negative consequences, impacts, all right, of the long distance trade. So the first one, which is negative for us to note, is there was warfare. Okay, there was warfare among communities, which was actually intensified. And the reason why this war was intensified is as a result of the need to obtain slaves. And we saw initially that slaves were obtained through intra and inter-community warfare. All right, so you realize there was that aspect of community A attacking community B to get slaves from them. And therefore, that meant there was intensification of warfare. People could fight to protect themselves or to raid the slaves. And as a result, you realize Africans suffered a number of consequences, including insecurity. We talked about suspicion. We talked about misery, loss of lives, and depopulation. And of course, there was destruction of property. All right. So in some sense, this trade, long distance trade, also had a negative influence that Africans faced. Then number 2, long distance trade attracted European visitors who ultimately colonized East Africa. The British used the long distance trade to routes and highways during their colonization aspect. So in this case also, I want us to note that the trade opened up. It opened up the interior. It opened up the East African coast interior. And therefore, those trade routes which opened up enabled the colonizers to approach and be able to access the interior, and thereby be able to influence, or rather to insert or exert their influence among the East African coast, leading to what we refer to as colonization. So in that case, you realize that most African communities, most African countries or East African countries suffered colonization as a result of the long distance trade which attracted visitors. That means probably if this trade would have not been there, that means that probably East African coast could have not been colonized by the colonial masters. Having looked at the local trade, among the long distance trade, and discussed into detail, now I want us to quickly discuss the international trade. And as we shall be discussing this will lay for us a good foundation, such that as we shall be getting into Form 2, we'll discuss more about international trade, and we'll be able to discuss regional trade and local trade. And we'll give examples of international trade like the transatlantic trade, which we'll discuss into detail. We also look at regional trade like the trans-Saharan trade, and of course the local trade which was carried out between different communities in Africa. Now in international trade, East Africa participated. East Africa participated in international trade during the 19th century with various countries. Just to mention but a few, we have USA, the United States of America, Britain, and France. Okay? So that is why we refer to it as international, because it involved different continents or different nations nationally. So it was a trade of between different nations. And there are a number of factors which we'll be able to answer that led to development of international trade. So the first factor which led to development of international trade, that's trade between East African coast and other parts of the world like USA, Britain, and France, include, number one, the East African coast or Africa was conversant with international trade. Remember, as we began in our earlier discussions, we said there was the development of what we refer to as the Indian Ocean trade. This Indian Ocean trade was involving various nations. So therefore, the people of East Africa were not green as far as international trade was concerned, because they had participated in the Indian Ocean trade by 1880. So when the 19th century is setting in, you realize the people had already had an experience of what it involved being in international trade. So that laid, we can say it gave them the foreknowledge, or rather the knowledge they required, and as far as international trade is concerned. The number two, there was a well-developed regional trade in the interior of East Africa. That means also it laid a good foundation. It laid a good basis so that in case these guys or these people from other nations were coming to the East African coast, they found the people of East African coast still had knowledge of what trade is all about. Therefore, there was a well-developed regional trade in the interior of East Africa. The number three, international demand for goods, for example, ivory, slaves, clothes, beads, etc. Actually, as we all know and as we have discussed initially, without demand, then of course there will be no need for trade. So there was that aspect of demand, that some parts of the world needed the goods which they never had, and some parts of the world needed to give out the goods which they had in order to receive those they never had. So as a result of this, there was that aspect of demand. Also, we shall see in our discussions, there was the aspect of growth of industries in Europe, which referred to as the Industrial Revolution. That means that these people, or these guys in those nations, needed agricultural commodities which were available in East Africa, and therefore that led to the development of international trade. So as we continue discussing, I want us to go for a short break, and then we shall be back and proceed so as can be able to understand international trade into detail and look at the consequences, both positive and negative. So let's go for a short break. We'll be right back to proceed from where we stopped. Welcome back after a short break, and let us proceed on our discussions. And before we went for the break, we had introduced international trade, and we said what it was, who was involved, and we said it was the participants included East Africa as a whole, and countries like USA, Britain, and France. And we discussed the first three factors which led to the development of international trade. And we said examples included that the East African as a country or as a region were conversant with international trade, having participated initially on Indian Ocean trade, which we discussed at the beginning of this chapter. And then number two, we said there was a well-developed regional trade in the interior that laid a good foundation in as far as trade is concerned. And we said number three, international demand for some goods. Examples, we talked about gold, ivory, slaves, clothes, beads, etc. So those were the first 3 points, and we are proceeding looking at the other points which actually led to the development. So the existence, number 4, is the existence of a class of enterprising merchants. This means there were people who were interested in business. There were people who were interested in carrying out trade, and they were also interested in giving out loans and credit and financing the trade, and therefore that also became a factor which led to the development of this trade. Of course, trade requires people who are enterprising and people who are willing to give out credit and financing to develop that trade. The number 5, there was also establishment of trade routes in the interior. That means it was easier because there were routes which were earlier existing. Therefore, it was easier for the traders to move into the interior, therefore making it easier for them to actually acquire and get the trade goods which were available only in the interior of East Africa. Then number 6, we say there was development of plantation agriculture in America and the consequent need for slave labor. Remember, we said America was among the countries or among the participants of international trade, and their main agenda or desire was to get slaves who were supposed to work in their plantations, because at the work of this 19th century, there was the aspect of plantation agriculture. There were sugar plantations plus other plantations which had been established by America, and therefore what they needed was slave labor. And where could they find these slaves? Of course, in East African coast. That is why they came also to participate in these international trade. Number 7, there was the aspect of relative peace and stability along the East African coast. Like we said before, and we'll say it again, that peace and stability is one of the important ingredients when it comes to trade and commercial activities. So East Africa was a relatively peaceful nation, and therefore it attracted more investors and more individuals who were interested in trading activities. Number 8, there was the aspect of industrial revolution. Okay, there was the aspect of industrial revolution in Western Europe. You realize that the wake of the 19th century, there was growth of industries. Also, we call it industrial revolution. And therefore, these people in Western Europe required raw materials. And where could they find the raw materials? Of course, in East Africa. So that is why also we find many coming from Western Europe entering into East African coast with a desire or with an agenda of getting more trade commodities for their industries. And then number 9, there is also the role played by Said Said. Remember, we said 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 transferred his capital from Muscat in Oman and brings it to Zanzibar. So he plays a greater role also in as far as international trade is concerned. And there are a number of roles which he played, which I'll be able to take you through and see how he also encouraged the development of international trade. The first one, he gave letters of introduction to the Arab and Swahili caravans moving into the interior. Remember, this time, in some way, Said Said was like the Imam General of the interior of East Africa. All right? So therefore, as the Imam General and having his headquarters in Zanzibar, he gave out introducing letters. In other words, the letters which he gave were supposed to be given out to the local leaders or the kings who would actually read the letters, and then after seeing the signature of Said Said, they would allow the traders to go into the interiors. All right, so he gave letters of introduction to Arab and Swahili caravans, okay, moving into the interior. So in this sense also, he encouraged development of international trade. Number 2, Said Said also gave them his flag to ensure their protection. So as they were moving with their caravans, as they were moving in their large groups, they moved with flags. And these flags played a role, and the role was to protect. In other words, to ensure that as they are moving, the flag shows that these are people under the guidance or jurisdiction of Said Said, and therefore they were not in any way questioned as to whose authority they were in the interior of East Africa. And then number 3, he simplified taxes imposed on trade by levying unified custom duty of 5%. So in other words, he also encouraged trade on those trades on the goods, all right, by levying a unified custom duty. So meaning the tax which was to be paid on imports and exports was unified, all right. So it was supposed to be 5% across the board. That means that it also encouraged the traders to know that as much as they participated in this trade, profit was assured in their activities. And then number 4, a role that played by Said Said, he improved the monetary system by introducing copper coins from India. Very important. He also improves or brings in the aspect of money. Remember we said the first method which was used was barter trade. But now in this case, Said Said, after the introduction of cowrie shells, he was ahead and introduces the monetary system. So that means the value of the commodity was attached in the amount of money or the amount of coins one was able to carry out. Therefore, it meant that trade was simplified. It was easy for them to carry out trade as opposed to the initial system that involved carrying of goods only and exchanging those goods for goods. So you see, as Said Said is also playing a very critical role in as far as development of international trade is concerned. Another role he played, he boosted trade by inviting Indian Banyans. The Indian Banyans, they are referred to as money lenders. Okay, so he introduced and invited Indian Banyans to finance the trade. Okay, so money was given for this trade, and this money was actually got from the Indian Banyans, who Said Said himself invited into the interior of East African coast or into the East African coast territory to encourage the trade. And the last but not the least one, Said Said signed commercial treaties, all right? In other words, he signed treaties which were in agreement for these nations, that is USA, Britain, France, and Germany, to carry out their trade within the territory of East Africa, all right? So he signed the first treaty or commercial treaty in the year 1833 with the USA, the second treaty in the 1839 with Britain, the third one, 1844 with France, 1871 with Germany. So all these treaties were signed by Said Said, and in essence, these trade gave these countries a leeway to move into the East African coast so as to carry out their trading activities. And of course, we discussed this and saw the participants who participated in the trade. They included the Arab and Swahili traders, okay? We had the Sultan of Zanzibar, and then also we had the foreign traders like the British, the Americans, and the French. Of course, we began by looking at those who were involved. So we had those who came from the East African coast, the Arabs, Swahili traders, and the Sultan of Zanzibar. In this case was Said Said. Then we had the foreign traders like the British, Americans, and the French. Those were the participants. Having looked at that, I want us to look at some of the trade goods which were exported from the East African coast. So in other words, these are the goods which were got from the interior, taken to the coast, and then thereafter exported to the various countries, including Germany, France, Britain, and USA. Those goods included the following as shown on the screen. So we have ivory, gum copal, we have slaves, we have gold, we had beads, all right? We have coconuts, okay? Then the imports which were brought, sorry, I think there's some error in my numbering. The imports which were brought into the East African coast included guns, okay? We had gunpowder, glassware, and clothes. So these are the goods which are brought into East Africa, I mean out of East African coast to the outside. And then these are the ones which are brought into the interior, right? We call them the the imports: guns, gunpowder, glassware, and clothes. All right, so these are trade goods involved in these kind of trade. Now let's look at the consequences. And consequences, we say, is synonymous to the effect, to the outcome, or the results. So sometimes when you're told to explain the result, the consequences, the outcome, the effects, they're the same thing. So the consequences are usually classified into two. We have the positive side and we have the negative side. So we will start by discussing the positive consequences of international trade. Okay? So we will look into detail, and I'll be able to give you detail of these consequences of international trade to the people of East Africa and, of course, in general. So the first one is that there was the opening up of the interior of East Africa to the outside world and establishment of international trade links. That means that there are some parts of East Africa which were actually locked, which were not actually accessible. But because of this trade, there was opening up, all right, of those areas to the interior of Africa to specifically the outside world. And therefore, there was establishment of international trade links. That means it was easier for the people of East African coast, basically, the East African interior, to link with the world in as far as trade is concerned. So that's very important to know. There was the opening up of the interior because of this trade. Therefore, meaning the interior was easily accessible, the goods could be accessed, and the people of the interior of East Africa could also access a number of goods which they were not able to produce as local citizens or local people. Number two, the European traders penetrated to the interior, hence introduced Christianity. All right? So you realize that initially, and I will show you in a short while, that we had the Portuguese who came earlier. The Portuguese who came earlier in the 1500 were not able, to spread Christianity because of the various reasons that we'll discuss in a little while. But with the coming of the British, with the coming of the Americans, with the coming of the French, with the coming of the British, it was easier for them, to spread out Christianity because of the way they related. So this trade is also important because it introduces an important aspect called Christianity. And in a little while, of course, we will be able to explore and see how Christianity became a very important aspect in the 19th century due to the trading activities. So there was that aspect also of introduction of Christianity. Number three, there was introduction of new trade goods. All right, that means that there were goods which were not locally available. There were goods which were not locally available within the territories or the pretexts of East Africa as a territory. And therefore, with the coming or with the aspect of international trade, we are having new trade goods introduced. Examples include cloth, right? We have guns and glassware. And of course, as you look at these, all of them have a positive impact in some way, depending on how we're going to look at it. Of course, there are some aspects which are negative in as far as guns are concerned, but it's important for us to note that it also has a positive influence or impact to the people of East African coast, of course, in as far as security is concerned. And then there was also the aspect of introduction of new crops. All right, and this one we've discussed, and we said there were some crops which were not locally available. All right, so they were introduced with the coming of the British. And of course, in a little while, as we discuss into detail, I'll give you examples of those crops which were introduced from which country. And then there's also the aspect that trade participants became prosperous and had high standards of living. That's important because with the participation in trade, there was the aspect of making profit, and of course, making profit, life standards of those who were involved in trade improved, all right? So it means that they were, withdrawn from, or they were able to break from poverty and have better or high standards of living, and that is positive, of course, to the people of East Africa and, of course, outside East Africa. Let us look at the negative impact of these international trade. The first negative, which of course is very obvious, that international trade boosted slave trade. Okay, that means that it boosted slave trade, that human beings were captured, were sold as commodities to participate, to be used, of course, to be used in plantations, like we say in America, in the French sugar plantations. So that led to human suffering, increased warfare, and heavy casualties with regard to the loss of human lives. So, of course, there was that aspect of inter-community warfare as they were trying to carry out raiding of slaves, and you realize those communities which were raided, retaliated, and in the process of exchange, we had casualties. We had people losing their lives, and that is not very positive. So therefore, it brought about suffering and untold misery among the African communities. And then there was also the aspect of European penetration into the interior, paved way for scramble and partition of East Africa. In Form 3, I will give you detail of what scrambling. Scrambling is to fight over, and partitioning is to divide. So there was that aspect of paving the penetration of European countries or European nations into the interior, and that led them to scrambling for resources, scrambling for space, scrambling for a territory, and later the partitioning of East Africa, in which I will discuss with you in Form 3, as we shall be looking at the scramble and partition of Africa. So that what leads to the scrambling is actually the international trade, which led the European nations to discover that East Africa, or Africa in general, was a rich continent endowed with a number of minerals, endowed with, good soil and good climate. And therefore that led them to scramble so as to have a stake in Africa. And then we also have number 3, negative, decline of local industries, right, due to the importation of cheap goods. And of course, apart from them being cheap, they were a bit more refined. Okay, so those local industries which, produced local goods declined as a result of people preferring the goods which were introduced from these Western countries. So that led to the decline of local industries which were producing local goods or commodities. Having looked at the international trade, that brings us to the end of that discussion on international trade. Now I want to introduce a very important aspect which we will be delving deep into and discussing into detail, and that will be the spread of Christianity. And we've said initially, remember, we talked about the coming of the Portuguese. The Portuguese come earlier after the coming of the Arabs, and when they came, you will realize that the Portuguese were not successful. So we say the foundation of Christianity dates back to the Portuguese period, that is between 1500 to 1700 AD. However, the attempt to introduce Christianity to the coastal people was unsuccessful. It was not successful because of a number of reasons. However, Christianity is introduced in the 19th century at the coming of other European nations. So I want you to note that the Portuguese were not very successful in their aspect of introducing Christianity due to a number of reasons. Number one, the Islamic dominance at the coast. Because the Portuguese, as they came, they dominated along the coast. But remember, before the coming of the Portuguese, the Arabs had already come. And therefore it means they had already laid a firm foundation. Therefore it was not easy for them to spread the Christianity. And then number two, there were poor relations between the Portuguese and the coastal people. Remember, we said the Portuguese had very, very poor means of administration. They were brutal, they were harsh, and therefore it meant that they established a negative attitude between them and the people of East Africa, and therefore they were not received well And as they were introducing the aspect of Christianity, they were rebelled against. And then and the reason why the Portuguese did not participate and were not successful is when the Portuguese rule collapsed, Christianity was abandoned and the coast of people reverted or went back to Muslim or Islam as a religion. So these reasons actually made the Portuguese not able to spread Christianity. But at the wake of the 19th century, we are having other European nations coming to the East African coast. And as they came, they were able to successfully spread Christianity. So in our next lesson, we shall be able to explore into details and see which are some of these nations that came to the East African coast and how did they participate in the aspect of spreading Christianity. So for today, this marks the end of our lesson. But remember, in our next discussion, we shall be looking at the spread of Christianity in the 19th century. Until then, God keep you safe and goodbye.